Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along. We are on the 1st of April 2024, and I will avoid the tedious April Fool's references in deference to people from superior cultures where we don't do that sort of thing. So we are here today after I should say, at the end of the Easter break to talk about a number of things, including, of course, the ongoing Israeli murder spree in Gaza and elsewhere, of course, the situation in Ukraine, which turns ever more against the NATO forces, and a scandal from rather more close to home, which is, of course, the Jeffrey Donaldson affair. If you're not familiar with who Jeffrey Donaldson is, he was until recently the leader of the leading pro-Britain party in the occupied 6 counties of Ireland, and he has suddenly resigned following the opening of a police investigation into a historic rape allegation. And there is much to this story which can be illustrative of how the British state has managed the occupation of the 6 counties in the north of Ireland, the kind of people that they employed to carry out this business for them, and the tactics that they used to keep them in line. And that's, of course, coming up as well. That'll be our last item on the agenda. So before we get to the agenda proper, though, I must issue a correction to something I said on one of the broadcasts last week when discussing the background of our current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. I stated that he actually came from a wealthy background. This isn't actually true. This was a mistake I made. In actual fact, Sunak's family background is more typically petty bourgeois, in that his father was a local doctor and his mother was in business, I think, and owned a small business or part ownership of a small business. Needless to say that this is not, coming from the upper bourgeoisie. He certainly is within it now, thanks to his career as a banker and his marriage to an heiress of a mega fortune coming from India. But it's important to emphasize when a mistake is made, and I made a mistake in describing his family background. And then it's important to correct that mistake because it could lead us to erroneous conclusions. For instance, the thing about Sunak's background is he actually has a lot in common with Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, and indeed with many British prime ministers, certainly in the period after the 1950s, when you get the last throw of the old aristocracy being in charge in the form of people like Harold Macmillan and Alec Douglas Home. You see that the intellectuals who serve the ruling class start to change. It always was the case back in the 17th, later 17th, 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, that the intellectual strata who were in the employment of the bourgeoisie, a lot of them generally came from the old aristocracy. From the middle 60s onwards, this starts to change to them coming from the petty bourgeoisie or even the labor aristocracy in certain cases, such as the case of James Callaghan, Prime Minister in the late 1970s, who probably is the British bourgeois political leader who came from the humblest origins. Of course, only their origins only matter in as much as they inform or don't inform the actions of the leader when they get into office. And in all of these cases, from Harold Wilson on down, have been, of course, all resolutely loyal to the British ruling class. But it's important to emphasize that that they are more from a petty bourgeois background now than they used to be, the British political leaders. Notoriously, of course, Margaret Thatcher always used to describe herself as the grocer's daughter, and gave many examples of her father, the great and enterprising small businessman. And of course, you have John Major, who came from a working class background, and famously, I don't believe he actually he attended a state school, John Major. So again, he comes from the working class. Didn't end up in the working class, though. Ended up very much a well-remunerated servant of the bourgeois. Tony Blair came from the petty bourgeoisie. Gordon Brown, upper-end working class, lower petty bourgeoisie. David Cameron is a bit of the exception rather than the rule, in that he is from the ruling class directly and married into a family even richer than his. And he is a combination of the older and newer money, in that he comes from an old aristocratic family, but also that family diversified itself into becoming bankers and money men. So Sunak is actually fairly typical in the modern period of the bourgeois, in that he comes from the petty bourgeoisie than the bourgeoisie. And it's important to make that distinction, because for many of these politicians in this period of decaying in monopoly capital, the political route is one way of actually securing their place in the class immediately above them, or in several, or going up several rungs on the class ladder. If you look more broadly at the American presidency, for instance, you can see that, for instance, Bill Clinton came from quite a poor background originally, if I believe. He was clearly an intelligent man who managed to manipulate his way through the system. Clearly somebody with a brain on him, but somebody who put it into the service of the bourgeoisie. So the promise of politics for people like Clinton, people like Gordon Brown, people like Obama, is that they can, by being a dedicated servant of the ruling class, they can raise themselves up a level or two. And as a comment comes in from Banana Bender in the discussion group, yeah, Jimmy Carter was also from a fairly working class background as well. So this is the promise of bourgeois politics now. It's not that you will, of course, change anything. It's that by becoming a dedicated servant of the bourgeoisie, this is one way to secure a positive outcome for you and your immediate family's finances. It's why so many of them stay in the public service once they've long retired from being politicians. Why you find so many politicians from the 90s and the 2000s hanging around in official positions in the House of Lords, being given official positions in the bureaucracy. Again, it's a way of keeping themselves being paid. And there's a reason why all these posts are very highly remunerated, because, again, this helps to bind them ever closer to the system. You need to remunerate your servants well, otherwise they might turn on you. And this is the one of the lessons of modern day bourgeois politics, which is you get a lot of well-remunerated people who are paid to spend decades relentlessly lying to the working class. And in the case of people like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, being certainly clever enough to know that they are lying and know that they are actively making life worse for a lot of people and not caring because they're getting rich as a result. So, beginning with a necessary correction, we'll now greet those who are in the chat so far. So we have James Graham with us, Banana Bender from Queen Victoria Land. We have Svetlana, who joins us from Moscow and says we seem to have skipped spring and gone directly to summer. Interesting. We've skipped spring and gone directly to winter. DE, who joins us from sunny Hampshire, Otis, who joins us, and Clinton Frazier, and Not a Pacifist, who says greetings and salutations. Peter, who says good afternoon, solidarity from perfidious Albion. And Dr. Ahmed joins us from Egypt. Comrade from Minsk joins us. It's Irish Partisan. Putin's shirt is with us. Fenrir Wolf is with us, as is Jerry, and is Gonzalo, who joins us from Madrid. Potted Rodent is with us, as is Grassy Knoll. Dean says some of the press reported Donaldson's antics as offences of historical nature. Euphemism production is really the only growth industry left in this decrepit economy. Very true. Finding new ways to say alleged rapist is a true growth industry, whether it's Jeffrey Donaldson or Diddy. Right, we got Alda Larkin with us as well, and Jawed and Scott, and Albert is with us. Here we go. So if you haven't done so already, be sure to like and share the stream. And we turn first to the discussion of the The assault on Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza and a reported death toll, according to sources on the ground there, of 300 to 400 bodies that have been found so far following the Israeli withdrawal from the area. And it does, of course, raise the question of why they chose to do this. Why spend so many days besieging, bombing, shooting at a hospital and executing those on the inside? And the obvious response is, of course, to draw upon our knowledge of people like Frantz Fanon and others who were analyzing the first stage of the anti-colonial revolution. And as we've noted before on this channel, if you examine Fanon's writing in his analysis of the French war in Algeria, again, nothing will surprise you about what the Israelis are doing. It is barbarity, certainly, and horror and mass murder, but it isn't anything that's not been done by others, not just the Nazis either, because people obviously understandably reach for that comparison, but the French, the British, the Italians, the Spanish, the Portuguese, all of whom have done similar things. And of course, US imperialism has done similar things. The French case is particularly apposite here because that's something which I think bears a lot of comparison with the relationship between Algeria and France, with the settlers and their supporters in France, considering Algeria to be France. Certainly in the case of the United States, and to a slightly lesser extent here, you have a layer of people in, I would say, at least the intellectual sphere and the political sphere, and some in the bourgeoisie, who regard Israel as, and this is quite correct for them to regard it this way in terms of their class interests, they regard it as an extension of the United States and of Britain, i.e. an extension of the collective West, a US or Anglo-US colonial project designed to, of course, as Joe Biden himself said, represent our interests in the Middle East. Joe Biden not being in his more honest and more coherent days. So again, why the assault on the Al-Shifa hospital? Again, we have to revisit Fanon's words and his analysis to find the answer. And the answer comes back to desperation and a brutality born of impotence. Because as Hassan Nasrallah has observed, as has the leadership of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine recently, and as has the Iranian leadership observed correctly, and also the most recent statement made by Al-Houthi, the leader of Ansar Allah. All of these men have correctly characterized what is going on in terms of Israel carrying out these now just mass executions. They're not even pretending that it was a stray bomb or the Palestinians blew up their own hospital. Remember early on when what was reported to be a J-down bomb went off above a hospital in Gaza and caused a gigantic explosion with a consequent death toll. The Israelis then spent a number of days trying to lie and dissemble about what went on there. Well, there's no lying. There's no good lying about this. All of the criminality is right out there in the open. And as the operation has gone on and the objectives set by Netanyahu have proven to be not only unreachable, but also to be seen as being impossible even by elements within the Israeli military now, which is the complete defeat of Hamas. That was his stated objective. I know that there are those who say that was never his actual objective, that Netanyahu's actual objective was the mass expulsion of the Palestinian population and the taking over of the land in order to route gas pipelines through there and things like that. Now, that would be a motivation for Netanyahu on some level, I don't doubt. Certainly mass expulsion of the population was and remains the policy, but they've been forced into a situation where they can't come out and say that as openly anymore, due to the fact that the Egyptian compradors aren't being quite as cooperative as the Israelis and the US would like them to be in terms of facilitating the mass expulsion of the Palestinians into the Sinai Desert, not out of any feelings of pan-Arab solidarity, you understand, on behalf of al-Sisi, merely because he fears the response of the Egyptian masses were he to be seen to be doing that. So they have not met their objectives because, again, Netanyahu had to do these big announcements to secure his own political survival. So he had to come out and say, we will defeat Hamas. And now it's obvious that they can't. Every time they leave an area, the resistance fighters pop up again and start engaging the Israelis again. More and more Israeli casualties are reported every day. They have, even again, according to Israeli sources, lost control of a larger area in the north of the country thanks to the fact that it's had to be evacuated due to the ongoing exchange of fire with Hezbollah. They failed to take any action with regard to Hezbollah. They've been exchanging fire with them, but the long promised and threatened invasion, I will come out and say I don't think that they will go ahead and do it. And I think they won't go ahead and do it because they'll have been told by the US military commanders that if they do that, they'll lose. And the Israelis know it as well. If the Israeli military commanders actually thought that they had a reasonable chance of scoring a win against Hezbollah, they would have done it almost immediately. What you are witnessing now in this terrible ongoing brutality taking place in Gaza, this act of mass murder at the Al-Shifa hospital, the hundreds who were reported to have been taken into custody, then had their hands bound behind their back, and then just simply executed. And then the bodies left and bulldozed or burnt beyond recognition. All of this is what an imperialist power, in this case the United States, does when faced with failure. And I say the United States because let's go back and cover ground we've talked about extensively before. I say the United States because it is the United States doing this. There's the people who think that in the United States that the Israeli colonial enterprise is an extension of the US. Those people are right. It is an extension of the United States and to a certain extent Britain as well. And that is why they are so fanatical in defending it. Again, to re-emphasize a point, they know that if this ends and Israel is seen to have been defeated, then the clock is ticking on Israel's existence. And if that is the case, then if the clock is ticking also on the US, British, and European ability to keep the Arab nations divided, which is what they've been working to do for over 100 years. And the fanaticism with which Israel is supported, and I say fanaticism because one should treat all the disputes between Netanyahu and Biden as not just cosmetic, but unimportant in the grand scheme of things. In the grand scheme of things, the only thing that the US has a problem with regarding Netanyahu's actions is that he's become an unsellable brand, or he's sullying the brand. Again, we go back to Thomas Friedman's argument made as soon as October the 7th happened. Thomas Friedman came out and said Netanyahu needs to go so we can basically do a genocide, but with a more plausible deniability. Netanyahu and his gang now are too openly bloodthirsty, too openly fascist. And what we need is some liberal genocide, which is why I think that the proper way to characterize the crimes of Israel are rather simply as the crimes committed by all imperialist powers in the modern era. This is how they all respond when faced with defiance. Now, ideally, the US would prefer, as it did in Iraq, as it did in Syria, as it did in Libya, to fund sectarian Salafist death squads to do its dirty work for it. Can't do that here. So again, the dirty work is being done by the Zionists. But the dirty work of US imperialism, it most certainly is, because US imperialism wants and requires Iran to be destroyed. Certainly the current political and theological, shall we say, leadership in Iran to be destroyed. It requires the leadership in Syria to be destroyed. It almost got that, and it would have done were it not for Russian and Iranian intervention. They require the destruction of Hezbollah. They require the destruction of not just Hamas, but the PFLP, the DFLP, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and anybody else who's a member of the National Liberation Forces of Palestine. They require all these forces to be destroyed, either the states themselves, or certainly the governments of those states, like Iran and Syria, or the powerful national liberation movement like you find in the form of Hezbollah. Therefore, you can only reach the conclusion that because they are supplying the Israeli army and haven't stopped, even with all the public slap fights between Biden and Netanyahu, the supply of weaponry to Israel does not stop and will not stop. Biden's already come out and said that openly. Because again, if they pull the plug on Israel, not only does that creates a crisis in Israel, which will lead to its defeat, it also creates a crisis in the USA that would be, if not exactly as severe as the crisis of 1958 in France, then it would still create a significant problem for Biden or indeed any US president, given, again, the level of fanaticism within certain areas of the bourgeoisie towards Israel would create a problem within the ruling class in the United States, were Israel to be abandoned right now. It wouldn't create too much of a problem in the American working class. I don't think that even most of the supporters of Donald Trump aren't exactly huge fans of Israel. A minority on the American bourgeois nationalist right wing are, and those tend to be the more religiously minded or the more just nakedly chauvinistic, who just enjoy the idea that they get to live vicariously through Israeli fascism, doing what they actually want to do, which is kill large numbers of brown-skinned people. But the point is that, and again, we must re-emphasize this is an assault carried out by US imperialism. Israel is just the tool, just as the Salafists were the tool in Syria and Libya, and just as the sectarian forces inside Lebanon have been the tool of the imperialists for, well, a century now, since the foundations of the modern Lebanese state in the colonial period. These states were set up deliberately to keep the peoples of the region divided and weak, divided amongst themselves. Israel is still serving that purpose to this day, which is why it will not be abandoned. No matter how many crimes it commits, no matter what horrors it engages in, the United States will continue to back it until the point where it becomes politically impossible in the domestic arena to do so. But even then, they're going to try and keep getting away with it. If Biden goes down, it makes no real difference to the bulk of the U.S. ruling class. They fund various people inside the U.S. media pretend that there's this huge fight going on with Trump, and some of it's real and some of it's not. But the more sensible U.S. bourgeois know very well that they can live with Trump for a few years if they have to, and it doesn't really fundamentally change their interests too much. They can work with Trump if they need to, and if Biden loses and Biden goes down, the Democrats get defeated because of their abuse of their own voting base. They're being revealed as to have been every bit the genocidal collection of maniacs that they portrayed Donald Trump as being. Then it doesn't really matter to the U.S. ruling class, certainly not the more sensible of them. They can lose the Democrats, bring in the Republicans. Yeah, there'll be some differences, but fundamentally, it doesn't really matter too much to them. Now, what they will want to avoid is a crisis of legitimacy for the American state, which, of course, was what the French state reached in 1958. They'll want to avoid that, and I think they probably will. But then again, what you always need to bear in mind is that the people in positions of authority in the bourgeois state, who are promoted by the ruling class, whereas many of them are, of course, loyal to their own paychecks, they are sometimes rather unstable individuals with some rather funny ideas. And this is especially true when the system goes into crisis. And so there may be some Zionist fanatics inside the US state machine, people who are intensely passionate about the presence of the Zionist state in its current form in the Middle East continuing. There may be some of them who fancy trying to pull off a France 1958 situation, but I very much doubt they've got the institutional support to bring in a de Gaulle figure to preserve Israel inside the United States. That's just not something which seems to me to be a particularly solid prospect. So they will continue to try and defend Israel as much as they possibly can, ignoring all the international judgments, ignoring all the UN Security Council resolutions, ignoring all the complaints. And they may succeed in propping it up for another, 3 to 5 years? Because that's how long I think it's got. 5 years at the outside. This level of instability that's going to come from the defeat that is now unfolding is only going to destabilize Israeli society even more. And the problem that the US imperialists face, because they would ideally prefer a more liberal face to Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, and Smotrich. They don't want those people in charge. They're happy to have them killing Palestinians on the West Bank and acting as fascist death squads. Yeah, that's fine. But running a state, having them be the face of a state, that's not something they really want right now. The problem that they've got, though, is that 90% of Israelis polled so far by Israeli media say that the Israeli government is either using enough force or not enough in terms of the assault on Gaza. That there is a significant body of Israeli opinion that regards Netanyahu as too weak, as not having done enough killing. So the question for US imperialism, and this relates to the speech made by Chuck Schumer the other day, where he called for Netanyahu to hold new elections and essentially fuck off and retire. Well, who's going to replace him? Because one of the reasons why Netanyahu is still there is because he's shown the most consistent ability to actually put together these rather shaky coalitions with these ultra reactionaries. And he's been the only one who can hold these governments together for more than a few months. We saw what happened when they tried to have Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid in charge. It imploded rather rapidly because it was so unstable. Because the growth sections in Israeli society, in terms of political opinion, aren't the old Zionist social democrats or liberals anymore. It's the ultra reactionaries. That's the growing voting base. That's the voting base that is getting more and more powerful. So what the US and through the likes of Thomas Friedman want is somebody to put a better face on this act of mass murder, and they can't find anybody. Gantz, the former chief of the defense staff, is just as hardline as Netanyahu, at least in words. It's very doubtful he would have done much differently after October the 7th, and continues to promise that he's the one who knows how to get it sorted. And we know by now what getting it sorted means in Israeli terms. So what the US wants, it can't get. It can't rebrand Israel now. It can't stick in some new liberal face, not without fundamentally destabilizing the country. The strategists in the US State Department and in the think tank world who are employed to do the policy formulation for the US bourgeois are desperately trying to find a way of rebranding Israel, of relaunching it, so to speak, when all this is over, and they're not going to be able to find a way to do so. The crimes are too public. They've recorded themselves doing them. The bodies are all there, literally lined up outside the ruins of the Al-Shifa hospital, hundreds and hundreds of people kidnapped and executed. And these are the stories that are coming out immediately now as the horror unfolds. Think of what we're going to know in 8 months' time, towards the end of this year. What level of barbarity will have been uncovered then? And again, let's return to our starting point of this analysis, which is that all of this absolute horror that has unfolded on this tidal wave of blood that they have unleashed in Gaza all comes from the fact that they are losing. And the assault on the Al-Shifa hospital only makes sense if you consider that not only are they losing, but they are losing badly. And so to try and reassert themselves in some horrific way, they carry out an obvious act of mass murder, and a very public one that is very well recorded. Again, this is Netanyahu's way of trying to secure his political survival. He probably knows now that the clock is running out on him, and at a certain stage, with the US not vetoing that resolution last week, it doesn't really make much difference in terms of the Israeli ability to carry on the killing. But with the economy contracting, with splits in the with the US becoming more visible not in terms of content of policy, but in terms of form of policy, and of course the public calls for a rebranding, i.e., dumping Netanyahu and the settler parties. All of this is adding to an instability in Israel, and so this is Netanyahu's way of trying to reassert himself. Whereas, of course, if a ceasefire resolution gets forced through both the Security Council and the General Assembly, again, doesn't mean much in terms of practical changes, but again, increases the pressure on Israel, isolates it further, doubtless wakes more people up, I think, to what is going on if suddenly all of these crimes are going to be published in news agencies across the world in a way that they wouldn't have done or wouldn't have been noticeable 20 to 30 years ago. Now the full horror is on display permanently, and the damage done to Israel can never be undone. So now they are in a position where Netanyahu is trying to reassert himself, as I said. By reasserting himself, that means doing as many killings in as brutal a fashion as possible before being forced finally to end this thing. And ultimately, will it end in the Israelis trying to assault Lebanon? I don't think so, because I don't think that they would win. They have apparently today bombed the embassy of Iran in Damascus. Now that isn't exactly a surprise either. Some in the Israeli state think that if they provoke some kind of war with Iran, it will be in their interests. But I don't think even the US imperialist actually want a war with Iran. Some in the US imperialist political structure think that they could have it, win it, but these people's idiotic calculations are precisely the same kind of idiotic calculations which led them into the death trap in Ukraine, because they calculate that, well, if we just hit Iran with some missile strikes, and if we up the level of sanctions to nuclear level, and we cut them off from as many different aspects of trade as we possibly can, then the economy will collapse. There'll be a glorious color revolution in Tehran, and everything will fall in our favor. That's their plan. The only plan they don't have a plan to actually invade Iran, because they can't. They don't have the men to do it. You would need at least 1 million men, and the US doesn't have that many available, nor are they likely to in the near future. So the plan that they have for all of these conflicts, whether it's Ukraine, whether the lunatics who want to go into Iran, and the Taiwan potential war, the plan's always the same, which is do the war from a distance, do it via an outsourced force if you can. They would love the MEK to be big enough to do the war in Iran for them, but I doubt that they certainly don't have the resources to do so. Rely on sanctions and cutting countries off from the international banking and trading systems, and then hope to trigger some sort of collapse internally via a color revolution. These are all the plans that they've got. This was the plan with Russia, and this was the plan they fully expected to succeed. If we go back to the riots in Hong Kong, 2019, what was the plan there? Use the Hong Kong situation to trigger unrest and destabilization inside China itself, and hopefully then open up the opportunity for some sort of palace coup or color revolution inside China. The Chinese were fortunately wise to the situation and were able to take action accordingly. Most specifically, when Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, tried to resign, Xi Jinping very specifically said, no, you will not resign until this is over. And again, the plan was the same. Try and trigger a color revolution, try and trigger some kind of internal revolt. And they certainly had the forces there to cause more trouble. But this is why the Chinese, of course, did a giant clear up of various different dodgy characters inside the party and the state 10 years ago, over 10 years ago now, 12 years ago, because they were eliminating all the US assets, or all the assets the US might be able to utilize come a crisis moment. So the thing that everybody who is remotely tempted to get involved with the US regime change operation should bear in mind is that they will all end up like Zelensky is ending up now. which is the weapons are running out, the money is running out, the political space for him is tightening. The Russians are advancing all the way across the front line. Now, even columnists in the Daily Telegraph, an ultra-reactionary newspaper in Britain, are openly admitting that Kiev could fall, that Odessa could go, and nobody seems to know what to do now because they can't deviate from their previous tactics, and their puppet is being destroyed. So if you're of from some sort of comprador bourgeois group and looking at this, why on earth would you still think that going along with the US is a particularly good idea, unless you're a completely compromised and corrupted figure who's just in this for a payday? So even the compradors in Armenia seem to be having second thoughts about NATO now, staring down the barrel of Zelensky's impending disastrous defeat. But to conclude the point about Israel, the US, even if it continues to back Israel, cannot save it, because that would mean having to take essentially direct responsibility for running the place. That is something that I think is not an immediate threat, but it's something that might come into play in the future, which is that if the Israeli state just looks like it's going to collapse, does the organ grinder take over the running of the place directly, or the puppet master comes out from behind the curtain? It's certainly a possibility, and there's precedents for sort of end of empire situations for this happening in the past, like before the immediate handover to the new government headed by the late Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. The British re-entered in an official capacity the old Rhodesia and ran the government there for a while as the negotiations were concluding. If Israel starts to collapse, we could see the US have to come out and take direct control of it, which would be an interesting one if they were obliged to do so, particularly to secure the Israeli nuclear capability. But that may be something that is a factor in the future. If they want to try and save something of the Israeli colonial project, they may have to take direct control of it themselves, given the incapacity now of the Israeli political leadership to actually carry anything out. All they can do is exercise more and more brutality. And again, the more brutality that they commit, the more that opposition gets stirred up in the region to the US presence there. Look at all the demonstrations that have taken place in Jordan, not to the point where the comprador regime of the king there is threatened directly, but certainly to the point where things are becoming more and more destabilized. So again, the US is caught between a rock and a hard place. Abandon Israel and lose all the influence they have in the region, risk Arab unity becoming a reality in the near future, or stick with Israel and lose all your influence anyway, because you're expelled from each country in the region bit by bit by bit due to resistance activity, and you lose the other comprador regimes in the area, which are seen to be quite accurately complicit in Israel's acts of mass murder. This is what happens when imperialism is stuck. It can't go forward. It can't go backward. It can't magically create a stable Israeli leadership out of nowhere. All it has to play with are various shades of fanaticism. It can't abandon Israel, because that would mean essentially pulling the plug on imperialism in the Middle East or West Asia, if you prefer, entirely. It can't pressure its comprador collaborators any further, because that would compromise their position. So this is imperialism stuck. It's not a pretty sight, what's going on now. The relentless grinding horror and brutality is what happens when a system is running into the ground. Again, look at the amount of killings that the French imperialism did right up until the end in Algeria. Look at the amount of killings that the Portuguese colonial regime did up to the end in Angola and Mozambique. And then look at the neo-colonial war that the US waged with the assistance of others in Angola for many, many years afterwards. Like, this is what they do. They don't let go of places without trying to reduce them to rubble. And this is what is happening right now. But in the end, they can't save the Israeli colonial system, and they can't save their own occupation of West Asia. It's all going down. And going down with it are, of course, as we've discussed before, the British and the Europeans as well. Like this end game, questions have been posed about this from contributors to the Telegram group. And the question's been asked, well, how long does the US system have? How long does the West have? And I think that is going to be an interesting subject for discussion in and of itself. So we will come back to that later in the week for a more thorough discussion. So we'll just pause for questions. Peter notes that he claimed to have been located in a strange land called Albino. You meant Albion. Carmo, good afternoon to you. Banana Bender says, American and Western Christians still cooking themselves over Israel's God-given right to conquer the former 12 tribes of Israel. Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I mean, I think with a lot of these Christians, their actual religion is imperialism. They're not, they might swear on the Bible and humble themselves before the Almighty on a Sunday. But if you look at some of these American Christians who are like all in for Israel, they're really just all in for American imperialism. That it's chauvinism is their God, not any kind of greater being, but the God is American empire for them. Putin's shirt said, Putin made an interesting statement recently. He is once again threatening the oligarchs who benefited off the rape of the 1990s, saying the state will seize private enterprises not performing well. The number of state-run industries has been increasing in Russia ever since Medvedev was president and planned to increase privatization. Yes, I've seen that. It's the case that they have taken over a number of industries that weren't performing up to standard over the course of the SMO, particularly in the armaments industries. So the armaments and munitions industry is, if not directly state-run in Russia, it's very heavily state-directed. So like the big state-owned combines do a lot of the production. There's some smaller private sector elements there, but they operate under a plan and they're told what to produce. So if they're failing now, then Putin doesn't have much of an alternative. It's now a life and death struggle. So you can't have these scumbags just looting the place and running away with all the money anymore. They won't invest, they won't do the job, then the Russian state doesn't have much of a choice. Plus, the Russian masses, and this might be the key factor, are in no mood to forgive the looters of the 90s and the people who continue to loot the country or try to up to now. So Putin is under more pressure to act and also has therefore more scope to act. I hope he will do the right thing. Biden's suggestion of smaller bombs was fiction, says Jerry. Everything about Biden is a fiction. Albert comments that the imperialists continue to do their crimes in South America. That's true. Scott says things haven't been going the US's way for a while now in the Middle East. And it's only going to get worse for them. Yeah. The UN Security Council resolution on Israel isn't going to change anything. No, not in a practical sense. The only thing it does really is it can be used for propaganda. And so it damages Israel and the US on the propaganda level. On the practical level, it doesn't do a great deal. That must be said. Putin's shirt says another US war is brewing in Haiti. The Americans have decided that the Kenyan thugs cannot do the trick and are now talking about sending US troops. How many wars can the US wage at once? Well, the Haiti one's an interesting case because would they dare to try and run it like they did back in the 20s and 30s? Some of them probably think that it's a good idea, that getting access to Kenyan resources and labor on the cheap is best secured via direct US military occupation. However, what that will do, if they're not going to, the idea of them outsourcing it to like Kenyan police guys was that the US was going to be able to hide behind them. If they're now realizing that some Kenyan cops aren't going to cut it, then, and they need to send their own men in, well, then that risks uniting the Haitian resistance to US domination in a way, because they can then focus on a direct hit and run guerrilla war against the US occupation. I mean, last time the US found a puppet ruler that it installed and trained an army and police force to do a lot of the dirty work for it. That may be what they have in mind. Because there was only a few thousand US troops in Haiti at any given time in the 20s and 30s, a lot of the rest of the work was done by local collaborators. So they will have in mind, I think, that they will send in a force to pacify, as they put it, the area, i.e. kill a lot of people until they can claim control, then try and find some local thugs basically to hire, put in a uniform and call them the army and police force again. That will be their idea. Woody Tobias Jr. says it's clear that American hegemony is coming to an end. Will they be complacent with second or third place? How far will they go to remain on top? Well, it's an again, we should do really an hour on this question alone, but I will be brief here. There is a wish amongst certainly the Chinese and the Russian ruling circles that the Americans would just calm down and accept that they're now number 2 or number 3 in the world, and that's going to be the end of US hegemony. The problem with that is that the US can't just call imperialism to a close, even if they wanted to. The US ruling class, their interests, or the dominant faction of them, their interests are global, which is why US imperialism continues to behave as it does. And they can't just walk away. They can't just say, you know what, you won, fair enough, we're done. We're going to go back to being a 50-state republic within the borders of the United States plus Hawaii. It's not going to work like that. The US ruling class will scream and kick off and want to defend every inch of territory. Of course, they're not able to do so because then their industrial base is decayed, their political system is decayed, the loyalty of the masses is just simply not there anymore. So they'll try all kinds of things on the way down, including fascism. Whether they're capable of pulling off the phony revolution that fascism always requires, or capable of doing the level of mobilization that fascism would require, that's another question. But I don't see them going down and just accepting that they're going to playing a lesser role in the world, because it's not about that. It's about defending the interests of the US ruling class, which are truly global. And there's not going to be an easy way out, or an easier way out like there was for the British, who just took a secondary role behind the United States and essentially used the military power of the United States to leverage their own power. Now all that's coming to a close, and you have non-imperialist countries bringing it to a close. So when the British Empire imploded, or started to implode, the US was already an imperialist power and could take over the running of a lot of that empire through neocolonialism. Now you have the additional threat, which is that the rising countries are at this stage not imperialist countries, and that's another problem, because you can't just hand over the empire to them to the management of somebody else like the British did, and hope that they'll cut you in on the deal. If we're looking in, and the effect of things like the war in Ukraine is to encourage sovereignist pro-independence movements in places like West Africa, which look to, like the new guy who's been elected president of Senegal, they look to take more full control over their country's resources to keep the manufacturing of raw resources into finished consumer goods, or finished commodities, or more finished commodities inside those countries, rather than having the raw resources shipped out and manufactured into commodities elsewhere. Then again, this puts massive holes in the US imperialist system, which can't easily be filled in. So this is the problem. It's not just a question of the US ruling class being psychologically unprepared to accept what they would see as a lesser role in the world. It's that their interests dictate their actions. And until those interests are either curtailed or destroyed entirely, then the US ruling class is going to keep trying to keep its position in the world via various blood-soaked methods. And therefore, the priority must be to ensure that it is brought down by the United States working class. That's the only real and lasting way it's going to go down. It can be defeated externally, it can be pushed out of various places, but until the US ruling class is forced to reckon with the US working class and loses that battle, then we are going to continue to see more bloodletting. Putin's shirt said, today, April's Fool's Day, the ICJ called on Israel to let in more aid. If they were going to amend their ruling, why did they wait for thousands more to be killed before doing so? Because these are internationally employed bureaucrats who don't want to do too much to offend the sensibilities of US imperialism, basically. The ICJ is a worthless organization. They all are. If these characters, if these organizations actually meant anything or were able to constrain imperialism in any way, they wouldn't exist. Scott says, similar to your point about Netanyahu, how the US was initially hesitant to put Syngman Rhee into power in South Korea because he was of how openly rightist he was. Yeah, and they did do in the end because he was a guarantor of their interests, but they would prefer more presentable figures. But when they can't get them, they'll go with the unpresentable. Putin's shirt says Iran plays a much more sophisticated and humane game than the US imperialist brutes. And this is the main reason the US hates Iran so much. I think the US hates Iran so much and gets so triggered by it because it's the country that they see as having lost. The 1979 to 80 revolution solidified the independence of Iran. It solidified it and made it more real than it had been before. And that's the lasting legacy, together with a certain degree of industrialization, greater military capacity of the country, etc. And all that put together is why the US cannot accept an independent Iran, because an independent Iran, it has access to a lot of resources. It's become a powerful actor in the region. It's stymied US imperialism on more than a couple of occasions. So a big faction of US imperialism now will do anything they possibly can to destabilize it and get rid of the Khomeinist system. I don't think they're going to be successful, though. I think the Khomeinist system remains pretty solidly supported by at least, again, estimates I've seen are between a quarter and a fifth of the population who are organized in support of the Khomeinist system. So that's not something that goes away easily. No matter how hard the US wishes it or no matter how many brutal terrorist attacks they carry out inside Iran, they will not shift that Khomeinist system using these methods. DE says, you can see the media trying to drip feed the news that the NATO proxy war is not going to end well. Yeah, going so well. Yeah, they keep hinting at it and running articles saying it's going badly, but it's, our leaders' fault for not being strong enough and standing up to Putin. But the truth's been known for years, and the military men all know the truth. They've just been lying to the population and lying to themselves about it. Good day to Dan Kovalik, who's joined us. Good to have you with us, Dan. Scott asks, can't Saudi Arabia become the next face of US imperialism in the Middle East if Israel goes? That's an interesting question. The Saudis are playing a bit of a game in that they realize that the US is going down. And so they've spread their bets to building relations with the Russians and the Chinese now. So, yeah, they're going to remain a reactionary force in the Middle East, in West Asia, undoubtedly so. They always have been, they always will be. But whether they survive the coming turbulence of the next period is another question. So far, Mohammed bin Salman has got by imprisoning his opponents within the Saudi elite who have opposed him. But would they be able to survive an internal disturbance? That's another question. Their power has long been dependent upon a U.S. military presence and continued relations with the United States on that basis. When that goes, which it looks like it will go within a few years, can Saudi Arabia survive without an imperial backer? That's the question. Is its state and society strong enough to do so? I don't think that it is. I think they'll end up going the same, following Israel down the tubes. If Israel goes, I think that the Saudis won't be too far behind them. Mohammed bin Salman seems to know that that's the reality, which why he's trying to build the Saudi state into a more stronger force. I don't think he'll succeed in the end, though. Putin's shirt asks, will globalism start fading or will it remain but to be absorbed into the multipolar world? Well, I would say globalism is in reality US imperialism. That's why I don't use the term, because I regard it as imprecise. There are no globalists. There are imperialists. The US ruling class are not globalists in the sense that they don't belong to the United States. They do belong to the United States. Their interests are, well, the reason the US state acts as it does is because it is acting in the interests of this most powerful section of the ruling class who have global spanning interests in terms of their investments and their deals and where they derive their profit from, but they are very much rooted inside the United States. It is a US imperialist system that might be global, indeed is global, but it is fundamentally rooted within the US ruling class and the US political and financial institutions. So when things start to go bad for them, they are, as they are now, they are trying to preserve their privileges by any means they possibly can. I don't think they will be able to, though, because, again, the American state has become too weak. The relationship with the masses is too fractured. The ability of the American economy to actually reindustrialize on the basis of currently existing American capitalism is too compromised. So the chances are that when the imperialist system goes down, we will see more disturbances inside the former heart of the empire, be it in Britain or the United States, and that a fight is forced here about the destiny of the country. Are we going to tolerate a progressively or regressively worse life here for the bulk of the working class, or in order that the ruling class can desperately shore up their privileges for a few more years? Or do we move on the ruling class and remove them from power entirely? Those are the questions that the American proletariat has in front of it, as does the British. Right. Mary says American hegemony is not going anywhere. They just gained control of Argentina. It's fading definitely in areas of the world. They are working very hard to maintain themselves in places like Argentina, which is why the puppet Milei regime was brought in places like Peru, in places like Brazil as well. They are going to, and Haiti. They are going to work very hard to at least, their fallback option will be to at least dominate completely the Americas, their Americas, the Caribbean, Central America, South America. If they can't hold down their presence in Europe or Eurasia or East Asia, the Pacific Rim region, then they will at least try and subordinate everybody inside Central, Southern America, and the Caribbean. That will actually be something that they look to do. That's why they keep talking about invading Mexico. So there's clearly plans afoot within the ruling class to carry out all kinds of horrors inside the Americas. But even that itself is a defeat, because it's a fallback to within the borders of the continental United States and the wider Americas. So yes, they will try to keep hold of it. But again, like the Argentine working class will and indeed are fighting back. And I hope that a stronger communist presence can take root within the Argentine working class in order to have that struggle waged in the proper way. Thomas says, America runs on prison labor, yet tries to lecture other countries on freedom and democracy. Very true. Where are we? Hello to Muniz, who's joined us. Does this imply that the US ruling class simply did not see it coming? Big question. They knew they had problems. They knew they had problems since 2008. They couldn't deny it. I think, though, that they very much saw the Russia war in Ukraine and the destabilization campaign there as one of their ways out. If they could inflict or appear to inflict a defeat on Russia, cause a crisis via the application of all these sanctions, cause some sort of palace coup, color revolution, or coup in general in Russia, get rid of the ghastly Putin and bring in a comprador regime or break up the country. That was their way through this crisis, which is why they so far are not giving up on it, even though they know it's going badly. The breakup of Russia, the looting of its resources, and the distancing of it from its relationship with China, these were all goals of the US military operation in Ukraine, and these are all goals that they have not and will not meet. Morgan says, the ruling class will take extraordinary risks when they know it's the weakest in society that will pay the price. Yes, it is down to us to make them pay the price. Chomva says, Privyet, tovarish. Privyet, right back to you. Question: Agenda 2030 with their 15-minute cities, surveillance, central bank digital currencies, and mega WHO power. What is going to happen? Yeah, that's a rather large question. Look, I mean, a lot of that stuff, like, I can't do all of this now because I'm somewhat pressed for time, but the 15-minute city thing. The 15-minute city thing is a classic example of an idea which, if actually implemented under a planned economy, wouldn't be too bad. I talked about this with the comrades from the Class Consciousness Project the other day. The idea of having within every area, every working class area, should have the services that the working class requires on their doorstep, so that your workplace shouldn't be more than 15 minutes away from you, that your children's school shouldn't be more than a 15-minute walk away, that any medical services that you require shouldn't be more than 15 minutes away, either by at least by very accessible by public transport. All of those ideas aren't bad. The problem is that these numpties who try and implement them in like places like Oxford, these like bourgeois politicians from like the Lib Dems or the Green Party or various idiots in the Labour Party, they're all trying to implement this in the context of decaying monopoly capitalism, decaying imperialism. So how do you think that's going to look when what you've got is that most working class areas face a drain of investment? So like services are being cut, access to health and education is going down in terms of the ability of working class people to reach these services from their doorstep. So what a 15-minute city is in the context of decaying British capitalism and decaying British imperialism, that's gated communities. Again, the comrades on the Class Consciousness Project live stream pointed this out the other day. That's the rebirth of the gated community. There's always been gated communities in Britain, going all the way back to like the glory days of social democracy. I remember seeing a documentary years ago about the fact that there was a petty bourgeois area in I think it was North London in the 40s that actually built a wall. Talking about Donald Trump's wall, they built a wall to cut themselves off from the inferior postcode. And there's various different places in Britain where you have like private estates, which are closely monitored, shall we say, by private security companies, where you're challenged if you stray onto the land there. So that's always been there. This would just make the sort of class division rather more stark. It would be used by town planners to try and contain what they regard as the undesirable working class areas and cage them in one particular area of the city, because that's how the system is set up. This is why Marxist-Leninists must approach all of these questions, to use the Chinese phrase, conversation sometimes with like Green Party people, some of whom are very nice and are not not complete lunatics, at least. Some of them have some very funny ideas, but I've met some who consider themselves socialists, who would agree on the need for a planned economy, even if they would be very, have their own obsessions as to why. And you try and talk to them about the fact that, okay, you say you want all this green socialism of yours, but you in Council X, if you're in council power in Brighton, are implementing like the same level of cutbacks to local services that a Labour council would. You're implementing the same town planning nightmares as a Labour or a Tory council would. And firstly, and they're powerless to argue against it. They just say, oh, well, we're doing our best. And maybe they are. Maybe they are, because the best you can do with this system in Britain as it stands right now, if you're trying to get something out of a local council in Britain, you are in for, and I know people who've got onto councils, you're in for a hell of a lot of work for very little reward, because the resources are being drained. More and more councils are going bankrupt. More and more councils are burdened with gigantic debts they've been left with under private finance initiative deals. Like, you can't get anything out of this. You try and push through even the most progressive reform in the world through a council in Britain right now. You can apply this also to the United States. It goes through, to use the term, to use the horrible term, the sausage making process, and what comes out the other side is poisonous to the working class, because that's the system. It's not just that the councillors are corrupt, though many of them are. It's not just that the bureaucracy is staffed by people who regard the working class with hatred and fear, even though it is. It's not just that the council is drained of resources. It's that you regard the picture in an all-around way, and you see that the entire system is rigged to only benefit the ruling class, that whatever benefit that the working class got out of local government or central government in Britain in the post-war social democratic settlement period, that's all gone now. What you've got left is these very sort of nightmarish things that are done by Green Party people or SNP people who think of themselves as these big-time left-wingers, but in actual fact are implementing policies which are very much the favorite of the ruling class. And again, like, unless you have the Marxist-Leninist worldview and are able to view the system in its totality and draw your conclusions correctly, you're going to miss all of this. You're going to find yourself in an argument over minutiae. Now, is it the case then, and I've had this discussion with comrades recently, that you shouldn't engage in struggle on a local level, that you shouldn't, say, campaign to, for instance, stop some of the ruinous attacks on the working class? No, it doesn't mean that at all. You should, or as communists, we should always engage with working class struggles as and when they break out. The thing is that we must always be honest with the class about what is possible and what isn't. The way in which a lot of the Trotskyites and others have gone about these struggles in the past is that they are not honest with the working class, in my opinion. They will engage in them saying, "Oh, we can win this, we can win this," and they don't come with an honest analysis and tell working class people, "Okay, well, we will support you in whatever way we can in this struggle to keep this hospital open, because that's manifestly a good thing for the working class locally. We'll help you in any way that we possibly can, but we will be honest about our perspective that this is going to be a very tough struggle that can only be won by mass working class organization and mobilization for a starting point. And then the broader point is that, look, the more you as a worker engage in struggle with the system, the more you will see that the system cannot be reformed, that there is no going back to the old social democratic period. And so we support you in this struggle, but we will continue to point out that the struggle needs to evolve to a system-wide one. Many people won't see that when you start off in a struggle over something in your community or your workplace. Your focus is naturally on that workplace, on that community. But again, the working class isn't stupid. The overwhelming majority of them will be able to draw the correct conclusions if they're presented with the right information as to why the struggle to get even the tiniest reform now, it goes on so long, they have to fight for so hard to get so little at the end of it. Right, where are we now? We have got many comments coming in. So, okay, hope I answered your question, Fight Back. Abtin Kamoshi says, Saudi Arabia's future lies with integration with Iran and BRICS, not USA and Israel. Well, the question is how, can that actually be achieved? With the US going down now, what does that mean for a country like Saudi Arabia, which has been built on having an imperial protector, be that Britain in the old days or the US now? What are the forces inside the Saudi ruling elite? How do they respond to the developing multipolar system? As I said, multipolar world just means a new field of struggle opens up. It's not the conclusion. Or I should say, more accurately, it's a conclusion of one particular phase of history and the opening up of another. There's no Fukuyamaists here. Hello to Dr. Jen Isaacson, who is watching or listening on Twitter. Good to have you with us. And hello to Zuleika. And Jenny, who's joined us. Good to have you here. Puddin Shirt says, yesterday I saw a video about Iraq's green zone. It was like a mini wealthy American community locked off from the rest of Iraq. It's unbelievable. Yeah, I saw documentaries about that as well. I know some people who've worked there. in British government operations. People I worked with in the NGO world years ago, and they said it's completely unreal. You could be conceivably in like a particularly hot area of the United States. One day it will be the walls will be broken down. America will abandon Iraq entirely, and the Iraqis will walk around it and stare in disbelief at what was done with the looting of their country, or where the people who were doing the looting lived. Irish Partisan says the USSR and under the first and second 5-year plans was the first to draw up and implement the concept of 15-minute cities. It promoted a sense of community with centralized services and workplaces. It also promoted a sense of equality as well as proper urban planning with green spaces as well for families to relax. Yeah, I mean, there's no reason why that idea cannot work, but it cannot work under this system, under this status, under this system we have now of decaying monopoly capitalism. That system's incapable of making even the best idea about town planning work. Given the way things are now, it will not work for the working class under this system. Under a different system, under a planned economy, where you have a workers' democracy, where the workers can play a full and active part in the actual planning process, because they're not given that opportunity now under this system. Under the planning process you have now in Britain and in the United States, and I think this would probably apply to most of Europe as well, you don't have a part to play in the planning system. The best you get when there's some change to how the roads are laid out, how which buildings get thrown up, most you get is a note pinned to a lamppost saying consultation open, and then the consultation closes in about a day, and then you are given the opportunity to make your objections known, and they won't be paid any attention to anyway. That's the way the planning process works. And even if you get your local councillor to agree with you, your local councillor is just one person in a system which is essentially run by a bureaucracy. The local councils in Britain are not run by the councillors. They are run by maybe the council leader, the top bureaucrats, and the central government. You, the voter, so especially the working class voter, and even a big section of the middle class voters, have no role in that at all. Zuleika, commenting on the green issue, says their green socialism also involves some blatant but shady new Malthusianism. A green once said to me she believes everyone should only be allowed to have 2 kids, and that was in Brighton. Well, I'm not surprised that was in Brighton, Zuleika. I went there for union conferences for many years. It is one of the worst places on earth. With due apologies to anybody who's watching from Brighton, but let's face it, your town has been taken over by some of the worst characters in Britain. Putin's shirt said, remember China's one-child policy that was forced on China by the IMF in order for the Chinese to secure a loan. I hadn't heard that before. I will have to look further into that. Dr. Jen Isaacson asks on Twitter, do you think that when Trump is back in power, he might genuinely make an alliance with Russia? This is an awkward one. Again, with Trump, literally depends what day of the week it is. He did want to do that. I mean, there were people behind. There was a genuine debate in ruling class circles going back to Trump's first time in office, 2016. Sorry, I should say 2017 to 2021. Before that started, there was a debate, and there continues to be one to a degree, of how the US ruling class should respond to the rise of China. And one of the ideas was, well, we got to split Russia and China apart. We'll do deals with one and then have our rivalry with the other. And then once we've weakened the Chinese, we can then make sure that the Russians stay in their box. I think that was Trump's plan. That's the plan that he adopted. And from the point of view of US imperialism, it makes it a good degree of sense. Now, is it possible? It wasn't possible in the end, because I think there was the group that favored the confrontation with Russia. They proved to be more powerful within the US political system and the state bureaucracy. And I think they've lost that power to a degree, because they are diminished by their association with what is turning out to be a disastrous and blood-soaked defeat in Ukraine. But they're still there. And also you have this wild and I don't want to say irrational. You have this wild and um, over the top, to a certain extent, response to Trump within the US bureaucracy. So I think any plan he had that regarding an alliance with Russia, it could potentially have worked had it been pursued by a more capable administrator in 2016, 2017, 2018. Had Trump come in with a more coherent team back then and actually looked at the situation in Ukraine and said, right, we're not doing this. This is silly. I want to focus on the rivalry with China. I don't want this silly war that you idiots are running in Ukraine. So you were cutting off this Poroshenko guy and then this Zelensky guy. We're telling them you've got to implement the peace treaty with the Russians. You've got to give autonomy to Donetsk and Lugansk. Crimea's gone. Forget it. We're not helping you get it back. And you're not coming into NATO. Now, had he done that, you would have seen, Keith Olbermann immediately doing a video, probably sitting on his apartment, crying, wrapping himself in a US flag and threatening to suicide bomb Trump Tower or something. But there would have been an enormous wave of opposition from within the bureaucracy, from within the intellectual and media spheres that Trump would have had to handle. And again, he couldn't do that back then. The balance of forces in the Republican Party was against him. He proved to be a poor manager of his own coalition and a poor manager of the state system. So when the state machine turned on him, other than complaining about it on Twitter, he didn't really know what to do. And he was dependent upon some very pro-imperialist forces at the very top of the Republican Party. Now, fast forward to today. Is it any different? You have in the Republican Party now more people who are not opposed to the idea of essentially ditching the Ukraine project and focusing on the China project. And so you have Josh Hawley, you have that always amusing, eccentric Marjorie Taylor Greene, who politically I find repulsive, but on the level of like being amusing, I find her quite entertaining. You have creepy old Matt Gaetz. You have like the Rand Pauls, etc. So there is a more of a solid base for ending the blood-soaked craziness in Ukraine now, the unending cruelties that have been inflicted on that country by U.S. imperialism. So he could do it. He could end it, but it comes down to, do that group in Congress and the Senate are there enough of them to face down the not just their enemies in the Republican side, but also a Democratic Party which will again completely unite itself, or try to unite itself around the idea of we're stopping fascism. The fascist wants to sell out the brave Ukrainians. Just don't mention Azov. And they'll try and run that scam on him again. Are him and the people that he has around him capable of responding to that? Because the only way you have around that is either you have a stranglehold on the congressional Republicans in the House and the Senate, and you are able to tell them what to do, and that this is the agenda. We are following this. If you don't like it, Trump will do a rally in your constituency, endorsing your only way of combating this. So is he able to do that? My guess is still no. He might genuinely want to do it, but I just don't think that Trump has the political machinery or the necessary intellectual forces, not just at his disposal, but around him. Like if he's still got Jared fucking Kushner as one of his advisors, that doesn't speak well of him and his judgment. If he's going to bring in, like, he may have learned a few lessons as to not trusting the beautiful generals, as he used to call them. But again, he's still a man who is too easily manipulated by praise, too easily manipulated by yes men. I mean, he's thinking about having like people like Kristi Noem as his vice president. Like Kristi Noem is other than like the libertarian stylings, is a pretty bog standard Republican politician who would have easily had a career in Republican politics 20 to 30 years ago. So again, like, some in the US ruling class would want that, and would see it as a sensible option. But to finally answer your question, I think too much time has gone past, too much blood has been spilt in Ukraine itself. Russia might not even want that deal anymore. Some in Russia would I think have wanted it 5 to 6 years ago. I think that Putin and others in the hierarchy have realized an almost Marxist level of understanding, which is that the president is just one man. The machine is much, much bigger, and the machine has its own whims, which are derived ultimately from the class interests of the US ruling class. So again, possible 6 years ago, much less possible now, even with the increased congressional allies that Trump has that might be with him on this. Still too difficult to get past what will be a unified and frenziedly determined Democratic Party. Even if they lose the presidential election, I don't see the Republicans storming the Congress or House and Senate to the degree where Trump has solid majorities in both that he can rely on. So I think just for too many reasons, it's too difficult now to answer your question there. If you disagree, let me know. Happy to discuss further. Matt says, Black Myths podcast debunked the myth that the US prison industry is primarily about profit. It's more counter-revolutionary mechanism for capitalism. I think the profit is a nice sideline. But yeah, the reason why the US vastly expanded its prison population was as a direct result, I think, of the movements that it faced in the 60s and early 70s, like the Black Power movements, even some of the Maoist movements, such as the early days of the revolutionary communists before they became the Avakian cult. There was a lot of revolutionary activity, not all of it, particularly, not all of it leading in the right direction, but certainly it disturbed the ruling class to the point where they decided to vastly expand their repressive apparatus, and they've been doing so ever since. So yeah, the profit is a nice side benefit, but it's still a question of fundamentally it being the need for the ruling class to expand their repressive mechanisms, and that's what the motivation, I think, fundamentally is. Right, going through various different comments here. Jen Isaacson says, poor Jared. Yes, Jared, overshadowed by his shady father and his shady father-in-law. Dear, oh dear. But you agree with my answer. Okay, well, the interesting thing to see will be, does he bring in anybody of great ability? Like, for all that I can't stand politically a figure like Douglas McGregor, who I just think he's a completely despicable reactionary, guys like that do have a bit more about them. So if he brings in somebody like him, then it will show that he's at least wants to make a show of it. But again, the thing you find, the more you look at and examine these like political figures, I mean, Trump stands out because he's a little bit more substantial than most, but most of these people are not particularly intelligent, not very well informed, and easily panicked. That's why they're in this position. Doesn't matter whether they're like right wing, left wing, whether it's AOC or various characters in the Republican Party. They exist in a bubble. They are easily panicked by like a ruling class, like an engineered moral panic. Look how long it took Bernie fucking Sanders to come out and say, "Oh, Israel might be doing some bad things." These people are fundamentally so divorced from the realities of working class life that's how you get to the point where you realize that the only pressure that's really on them comes from the ruling class and comes from the weird cliques that operate inside Congress and Parliament. That's why you have Humza Yousaf in Scotland right now pushing through that ridiculous law on banning the causing of offense to anybody, apparently, except those who want to say that perverted weirdos shouldn't be able to force their way into women's spaces. Like, That's why you look at like a Humza Yusuf figure. I'm talking about this because it's a current issue in Britain. And like you can only come to the conclusion that that guy is an idiot. Like same way that Nicola Sturgeon was an idiot. And because these people exist in these like tiny bubbles where like they only ever listen to like think tank weirdos and representatives of like tame academia, who put forward these like strange ideas, be it a 15-minute city, be it the idea that a man can become a woman just by wishing it was so, be it the idea that it's a very good idea and progressive that we give more weapons to fascists in Ukraine. All of those ideas take root in like supposedly leftist figures, because these aren't figures that are connected with the working class. If they were, that many of these ideas wouldn't last 5 minutes. But again, politicians in this era, bourgeois politicians, are kept deliberately in a tiny, tiny circle where the only pressure that really matters to them is the pressure from that circle, not from the working class, who they largely despise. For a figure like Humza Yusuf in Scotland, he has made some statements on Palestine that are, of course, related to his own family's experience of being repressed by Israel, or his in-laws' experience of being repressed by Israel. So when it comes to that, suddenly he makes a correct statement because he's actually connected to the real world in some way. But what this idiot doesn't realize is by restricting free speech and bringing in this so-called anti-hate speech law, what he says about Israel, about the Gaza war, is defined, or wants to, the people in the Conservative Party and in the Labour Party want to define that as hate speech. Remember Suella Braverman, our dear departed former Home Secretary, saying that the Palestine solidarity marches were hate marches? Well, they're serious about that. I mean, my comrades got arrested for a hate crime, for selling a booklet that made correct comparisons between Zionism and fascism. I mean, Humza Yusuf should really pull his head out of his orifice, because like the things he says about Israel and Palestine today are what he could be arrested for if he comes to England and the Tories manage to make it into a hate crime to utter any criticism of Israel. Or maybe Keir Starmer does it, who I've said for a while is the more likely figure to actually carry this through. Right. Okay. Here we go. We got more stuff coming in. Okay. Jen Isaacson asks, what's your take on MAGA communism? Yeah. You're getting in there with the easy questions. Bloody hell. I've said it before. Happy to go into it at greater length on another time, on another stream. I'm not favorable. I understand the motivations of people like Has, and I've read his rather extensive justification for the way he puts this, but I think fundamentally it's a form of opportunism. It's tail ending something rather than setting an agenda. And if people want me to explore this more, I mean, we get a lot of questions like this. I will tell you what. I'm responding now to Dr. Jen Isaacson, who asked the question. If you're happy with it, I will take your question and address it in the weekend Q&A. So this Sunday coming up, I'm going to do a Q&A for a couple of hours or so. So it's something that I could better address in that. So if you're happy for your question to be taken up in that way, do let me know, because it's a question that loads of people have asked me. So it's probably about time I got to grips with it more thoroughly. Would be nice to have some Brighton insight. Yeah, well, you've heard my opinion on that. Okay, so I'm going to have to call it a day for now. Now, thanks to all 217 of you who are watching live. The audio of this will be up on the Patreon later today, and you can be able to find the long-promised RoboCop review will be coming. It's going to be on the Patreon for the next week. It'll come out there, and it will be a comparison between the 1987 version and the 2015 version. I think that's a profitable way of pursuing that particular discussion. All right. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in, and I will be back with you again tomorrow at 10:30 in the evening. So a late show for British and European viewers, but an earlier one for the US viewers. And that will be focused on the Baltimore Bridge collapse. So Thanks to everybody who's joined in. Thanks to everybody who's asked questions. Join me again tomorrow if you can. Other than that, I'll see you next time.